I want to describe what actually happens inside a person who has been handed real power, whether it's a nation or just a small office with a nameplate on the door. Not the politics of it, the psychology. A man fills a space he normally cannot fill. He does it by taking on qualities and contents that were never his alone. They belonged to everyone or to no one, and now he's wearing them as though they'd always been his size. I called this psychic inflation, and I want to be precise. It isn't a figure of speech. It's a real, observable state. A man puffed up beyond his own proportions, and it happens to tyrants and middle managers by exactly the same mechanism. Here's the mechanism itself. A title, an office, a role. These are collective facts. They exist because a great many people cooperated over a long time to build the institution that the title refers to. And whatever dignity the office carries rests entirely on that collective agreement, not on the individual currently holding it. The moment a person forgets that distinction and identifies with the office instead of merely occupying it, he behaves as if he were the entire collective structure in miniature. I gave this its own motto once: L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. Not spoken as arrogance necessarily, spoken quite sincerely as a simple failure to notice where the man ends and the office begins. There's a second, subtler version of the same thing: inflation through knowledge rather than office. A person encounters some genuinely significant insight about themselves, about the unconscious, about the world, and instead of carrying that insight as something they've understood, they begin carrying it as something they've become. I've seen this in its purest, most undiluted form in patients suffering full psychotic inflation, convinced they were in telephonic communication with other planets, convictions that read at a clinical remove, like a crude enlargement of something that happens in a much milder, much more socially acceptable form in perfectly sane people every day. I described the political version of this directly. A mass of people, lacking any organizing shape of its own, will almost always produce a leader to give itself form, and that leader, I said, almost infallibly becomes the victim of his own inflated ego consciousness, not because such men set out to be corrupted, because the position itself is an open invitation to stop noticing the line between the man and the role, and very few people, once handed that much unearned size, remember to keep checking where the line actually is. The tell is always the same, whichever century you're watching it in. A person starts speaking in the first person plural about matters that concern only himself, or starts to find personal criticism of himself indistinguishable from an attack on the nation, the company, the cause. That collapsing of distinctions is the inflation showing itself from the outside. From the inside, it doesn't feel like distortion at all. It feels, I'd imagine, almost peaceful, godlike, if I can use that word without irony, in the sense of finally feeling adequate to a size you were never actually built for. Here's the part I'd ask you not to exempt yourself from. You do not need a nation or a throne to do this. You need a job title you've stopped being able to laugh at. I said plainly that this happens in ordinary life just as often as it happens on the analyst's couch. The humorless way a great many men identify with their business or their title is the same mechanism at a domestic scale. The office is certainly your special activity. It is also, at the same time, a collective factor you did not build alone and do not own. And the moment you can no longer tell the difference between the two, you've usurped qualities that were never inside you to begin with. They were outside you, on loan from the collective, and you've simply stopped returning them. The reason this matters isn't moral, it's structural. A person in this state has, in effect, stopped being a size that can be corrected. Criticism bounces off an inflated man the way it would bounce off an actual deity, because he no longer experiences the criticism as being about him specifically. It's being lodged against the office, the cause, the nation, and he has fused with all three. So what deflates this, since bruising a man's pride rarely does? The real work is the same individuation I described before, run in reverse against a different pressure. Individuation gets smothered from one direction by pure conformity, disappearing into a role because everyone around you is doing the same. It gets smothered from the opposite direction by inflation, disappearing into a role because the role has started to feel bigger and more important than you are. both failures end at the same place, a person who can no longer locate the boundary of their own actual size. I'll add one thing here that surprises people. Imitating some admired, larger figure, copying their manner, their confidence, their certainty, is not the cure for smallness and is not, itself, individuation, even though it looks like a step toward becoming someone. It's actually the opposite, a more sophisticated form of collective bondage, because you've simply swapped one borrowed size for another. The only real corrective is the plainer, less flattering discipline of finding out, in detail, what is actually yours. Your actual talents, your actual limits, your actual authority, separated carefully from whatever the office, the title, or the admired figure lent you on the way in. Most of what any of us is proud of turns out, on close inspection, to be partly on loan. Finding the part that isn't is the whole exercise. This connects directly to the leader I mentioned when I first described a psychic epidemic and to the projection I described in the scapegoat video. A crowd that's already unloaded its own darkness onto an enemy has, at the same moment, usually handed its own missing sense of size to a leader, and both transactions are how a population avoids doing the one thing that would actually help, each person finding and staying inside their own real proportions. I don't think there's a shortcut past that discipline. I only think the alternative is worse and considerably more common. If you like my videos, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.